I'm Brad Grant. I'm the chair of the Department of Architecture here at Howard University, and I'm happy to have you here. And welcome to the first U.S. Conference on Housing, Land, and Property in Crisis. And welcome to Howard University. I want to begin by acknowledging that we gather on this site within the territory of many indigenous people that have known the Potomac Valley and its land and its water as their homelands for thousands of years to the present day, including the Algonquin, the Iroquois, the Suquan, and the Piscataway peoples. Howard University has a historic Black college and university, which we call the HBCUs, whose motto is truth and service. We recognize that long prior to the European occupation and through today, indigenous people have stewarded the lands and the waters of the American continent. Thus, we begin by recognizing the native nations' past, present, future, unbroken, and unbreakable connections to this land. This conference inspires us to consider our own histories on this land. We at Howard are engaged in learning about the land we sit on and its relationship to the communities of our ancestral people, the Nataq'an, the Anacostan, part of the Piscataway chiefdom, recognizing that today's Piscataway are descendants from the merged chieftains people. The same land was claimed and taken by the U.S. Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, or referred to as the Freedmen's Bureau, headed by the namesake General Otis Howard, to found Howard University in 1869. Over the 154 years, Howard has built on this confiscated land and further shaped the place, buildings, and landscapes that we have today. We recognize these thick and layered histories and work to have our teaching, scholarship, and practice not merely amplify such narratives, but contribute to the support of indigenous people, places, and communities. Now, with that, let me introduce Vice Provost Dr. Kim Jones of the university.
Good morning, everyone. It is my honor to be here. What Professor Grant did not say, I'm also a civil engineer by training, and so issues around the kinds of things you're talking about today are near and dear to my heart. So it is my great honor to welcome you here to Howard University this morning to the inaugural U.S. Conference on Housing, Land, and Property in Crisis Context. Located right here on our campus, organized in partnership with our Department of Architecture here at Howard University. So I know you'll be gathering over the next 2 days with a shared purpose to exchange experiences and practices that directly address the challenges confronted by displaced, at-risk, and marginalized communities, not just across the U.S., but abroad. So the overarching goals of your conference are in direct alignment with our interests here at Howard University. As you know, as Professor Grant just said, we're a culturally diverse, comprehensive, research-intensive, historically Black university located in DC. We provide an educational experience of exceptional quality at the undergraduate and graduate levels to students of very high academic potential. We have an abiding interest in domestic and international affairs, and the university is deeply committed to continuing to produce leaders for America and the broader community. Our core values include excellence, leadership, service, and truth. Howard's aim is to forward the development of scholars and professionals who drive change and engage in scholarship that provides solutions to contemporary global problems, particularly ones impacting the African diaspora and other marginalized people. So at Howard, our commitment to social justice and equity and issues around housing is unwavering. We understand that housing, land, and property issues are not isolated concerns, but are deeply interconnected with broader systemic injustices. By leveraging our collective expertise, experiences, and dedication to this cause, we can develop comprehensive strategies and actionable recommendations that will drive transformative change in marginalized and in vulnerable communities. So in closing, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to each and one of you for being here over the next couple days. Your presence, insights, and commitment are invaluable as we strive to share experience and best practices related to HLP issues in communities that often do not have a voice at the table. So let us seize this moment to connect, to learn, to collaborate, and work together to forge a path towards a future where housing, land, and property rights are fully realized for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So I'm Julien Schopp from Interaction. Really nice to see all of you here. We're very excited by the program and by our keynote speakers. So I'd like to, first of all, thank Howard for hosting us in this really great venue, and also thanking IOM as a partner, as well as Habitat for Humanity, USAID BHA, as well as Verent Solutions and the Global Protection Cluster. This is really a collective endeavor to have this conversation. I think this conference on HLP is overdue in the US. We've been talking about these issues for a while, and it's really a unique opportunity today to bring practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders around this table. So as was already said prior by the Vice Provost, the goal of this conference is really to share different perspectives on housing, land, and property, to share experiences, and to bring together all the different stakeholders that we just talked about. For now, our working definition of HLP is the area of humanitarian action that focuses on the rights of people to their most valuable, immovable assets, and that, of course, is land, houses, and buildings. And there's two key concepts I think that we have to remind ourselves of, and that's property restitution and security of tenure, two very important points to bring to bear. Around crises and conflicts, HLP is often not really looked at in humanitarian response or looked as an afterthought. I think it's important today to look at its relationship with conflict. Housing, land, and property can cause conflict. It can be the result of conflict or of a disaster. And also it, to some extent, prevents us from resolution of conflict or return of displaced people. So it really touches every area of conflict, displacement, and crises. Because it's fundamentally a development issue, we often don't have sufficient conversations at the field level in humanitarian response around HLP. Hopefully those 2 days will assist us in finding solutions that we can try to socialize, as well as better understanding collectively of what we need to do. So I'll just leave it at that in terms of introductory remarks. Very proud to be part of the organization of this event. I'm now going to really thank you all for being here, and I'll pass it over to our first keynote speaker, Lise Grande. So, as I'm sure you are aware, Lise is the president and CEO of USIP, the U.S. Institute for Peace, and she's got 25, 30 years of experience in the international sphere. Most notably, I think recently, as the humanitarian coordinator and resident coordinator in Yemen, as well as South Sudan, where I know a lot of issues around housing, land, and property have arisen and are still very much part of the conversation. So please welcome me, join me in welcoming Lise.
I'm very pleased to be with you this morning. As Julien said, I'm Lise Grande. I'm the head of the United States Institute of Peace It was established by the US Congress in 1984 at the height of the Second Cold War and after the US withdrawal from Vietnam. It was established as a nonpartisan public institution that was dedicated to helping prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. And because USIP has this mandate, my comments this morning are going to focus on housing, land, and property rights in the context of conflicts abroad. During my brief reflections, I'd like to do two things. I'd like to start by reflecting on the types and consequences of the violations of HLP rights during war. And secondly, with your permission, I'll take this opportunity to offer possible recommendations for preventing these violations, and when this fails and violations occur, for securing restitution. HLP rights are, and as Julien said, are increasingly recognized as one of the most important dimensions of civilian protection. This is because they are the necessary foundation for ensuring the safety, the dignity, and the well-being of civilians who are caught in armed conflict. It is obvious, although not always well appreciated, that violations of HLP rights are the most widespread during any conflict of any category of rights. HLP violations occur in every war, usually at huge scale. So much so that experts and students of history have come to regard HLP violations as one of the defining features of modern warfare. HLP violations lead to profound suffering, displacement, insecurity, deprivation, loss of community, loss of livelihood and income, and in the worst situations are linked to ethnic cleansing, egregious violence, and near total immiseration. The most common HLP violations during war are forced evictions. These take multiple forms. Probably the worst are evictions which are executed for the purpose of ethnic cleansing. Examples of this include the evictions of Bosnian Muslims and Croats by the Spritska army and Serb paramilitaries during the Bosnian War in the 1990s. A more recent example are the evictions and forced displacement of close to 1 million Muslim Rohingya from Myanmar by state security forces in 2017. Evictions for the purpose of territorial conquest are similarly devastating. We see this happening right now in Ukraine, where Russian forces are annexing land and confiscating property in the parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions which they are unlawfully occupying. The situations in East Timor during the Indonesian aggression in 1975 and Cyprus in 1974 also come to mind. A third type of eviction is for tactical military purposes. This is currently happening in Khartoum, where the RSF paramilitary is confiscating houses, buildings, and property and using these locations to establish fixed and mobile launching platforms to store weapons, position snipers, and bunker their fighters. Yemen is another example where armed groups continue to commandeer residential and commercial property for military operations aimed not only at belligerents, but also at civilians. Forced evictions for the purpose of depopulating cities and establishing unoccupied no-man lands was done to devastating effect by ISIS in Iraq and Syria and is being done now by the Al-Shabaab in Mozambique, where once thriving communities have fled en masse, leaving only ghost towns across one of the country's most mineral-rich regions. The response of humanitarian and protection organizations, many of whom are represented here today, to this wholly devastating aspect of modern warfare has been and remains vital. Starting in the mid-1990s, a major global campaign to protect HLP rights and obtain redress for their violation during conflict began taking shape. Discussions about what to do first centered in the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, which is the body of independent international experts that monitors implementation of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which, as you may know, was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1965. In the early 2000s, the UN Commission on Human Rights, it's now called the UN Human Rights Council, asked the UN Special Rapporteur, Paulo Pinheiro of Brazil, to start drafting principles to shape and guide action on HLP rights. 5 years later, in 2025, these principles, known as the Pinheiro Principles, were formally endorsed. The Pinheiro Principles are important and they're useful. There are 23 of them. They describe the scope of 9 rights, starting with the right to housing and property restitution, and including the rights to adequate housing and the right to be protected from unlawful and arbitrary displacement. The principles assert the right of people who have been the victim of eviction and displacement in conflict to restitution of their homes and property and compensation if this is not possible. The principles also describe the legal, policy, procedural, and institutional mechanisms that states can and should use, are obligated to use, to uphold HLP rights, and they outline the responsibilities of the international community. For 25 years, I served with the United Nations as a humanitarian on the front lines or in leadership positions in 12 wars. Housing, land, and property issues were either at the center or a critical aspect of every single one of these conflicts. With your permission, I would like to single out 6 steps the international community, humanitarian, and development organizations can take that, in my experience, are likely to have the biggest impact on safeguarding HLP rights in crisis and conflict countries. The first step focuses on prevention. Humanitarian coordinators, these are the people who are entrusted with coordinating humanitarian action in a conflict country. Humanitarian coordinators should be responsible, as part of their terms of reference, for seeking and securing agreement by all parties to desist from forcible displacement and eviction. And in instances when these do occur, the humanitarian coordinator should insist that the parties immediately sanction, discipline, and hold the perpetrators responsible. In the absence of a general ban on evictions and displacement, which may be nearly impossible to secure, the humanitarian coordinators and others can negotiate directly with the belligerents to establish ceasefires or safe zones where forced evictions are prohibited. The second step focuses on proof of ownership. This has 2 aspects. On the one hand, humanitarian and legal aid organizations should help civilians to retain, safely store, and protect all necessary documentation to prove ownership of their housing, land, and property. On the other hand, development organizations should be providing technical assistance to the government's official cadastral offices to ensure the proper filing and storage of property and land titles. Development agencies can also help cadastral offices formalize customary land rights, upgrade and modernize land registration systems, and maintain secure digital records of land ownership. The third step focuses on rental subsidies and rental evictions. In situations where displaced families have managed to rent secondary housing, but are unable to cover the costs of this housing either initially or over time, humanitarian coordinators and organizations should encourage local authorities and donors to subsidize rents for displaced families. These programs make a lot of sense. They help ensure that landlords are not disadvantaged. They support local economies, and they foster good relations between host communities and the displaced. Humanitarian coordinators, however, can and should go a step further and encourage local authorities to institute a conflict-related temporary freeze on all rental evictions, giving families security of temporary tenure during the crisis itself. The fourth step focuses on legal access. The international community can, and quite frankly is expected, to play a decisive role in expanding legal access by providing legal aid to the victims of forced evictions, assisting them to understand and assert their rights. Legal aid programs can help people file claims. They can help negotiate compensation, and they can help families to navigate the complex legal terrain that is related to property restitution, land disputes, contested ownership, and tenure regularization. Mobile clinics can be dispatched to remote areas and into marginalized communities and used as a platform for providing legal advice, for helping with document preparation, and for mediating with authorities. A key part of expanding legal access includes strengthening local legal professionals so that they are in a better position to provide better legal assistance to HLP victims. The fifth step focuses on peace negotiations and transitional restitution. The international community can and should use its good offices and its leverage to include HLP restitution as one of the key issues to be negotiated during the peace process. If conceived as a legal remedy available on equal terms to all victims of wrongful dispossession, if done transparently with balance between the rights of claimants and subsequent occupants, with streamlined administrative procedures and relaxed evidentiary rules, restitution is one of the most important durable solutions for ending dislocation and preempting future conflict. The sixth step focuses on compensation. In instances when housing, land, or property cannot be restored to its original occupants or owners, perhaps because of destruction, the Panero principles assert the right of displaced persons to full and effective compensation. For cash-strapped countries struggling to rebuild infrastructure, provide services, and jumpstart their economies, a trust fund to finance HLP compensation supported by the belligerent parties and/or the international community can make all the difference. Final observation. 25 years ago, when I started working as a humanitarian in conflict zones, there were only a handful of people that were dedicated to this set of issues. Picture is very different now. Right now, there are active HLP coordination and protection teams working in Afghanistan, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, the Palestinian occupied territories, South Sudan, Syria, and Ukraine. This is tremendous. Everyone joins me in saluting their work. I'd like to thank Howard University, the International Organization of Migration and Interaction, for inviting me to be with you today.
Thank you, Lisa, for an amazing speech. I think you covered all of the issues that we are dealing with, and possible solutions to take on. Next, I'd like to introduce the opening panel, which will delve into issues and trend, what we are dealing currently in the humanitarian and development sphere. Professor Dahlia Nduom, please come in, who will moderate, and Chuck Setchell from BHA, Karol Boudreaux from USAID, Ibere Lopes from IOM, and Serra Lasa from Habitat for Humanity. Thank you.
On? Yeah. Great. Morning, everyone. My name is Dahlia Nduom. I'm an assistant professor of architecture here at Howard University, and I'll be moderating this first opening panel today. So as Hilmi said, this session will explore issues around practical humanitarian and long-term development perspectives. The panelists here today will speak from their experience and discuss some of the ways they have addressed or supported each of the challenges. So the way we've structured this session is I'll introduce panelists. We'll hear from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. So first, we're very honored to have Mr. Charles Setchell. He has over 40 years of experience in managing the process of physical, social, and economic change, both in the U.S. and abroad. This professional experience is rooted in undergraduate and graduate degrees in urban environmental planning from the University of California, Davis, and Berkeley, respectively. His doctoral studies were in urban planning at MIT, and he conducted doctoral research supported by a Fulbright Fellowship and the Carter Foundation Award. Mr. Setchell has participated in nearly every major international disaster crisis involving a shelter response since his arrival at the USAID Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. He makes presentations and training courses, meetings, and conferences regularly, as published on a wide variety of topics. Thank you for joining us. We're also joined by Ms. Karol Boudreaux. She's a senior land and resource governance advisor at USAID, where she supports USAID missions, bureaus, and offices to design, develop, and implement activities and policies that promote secure land and resource rights and reflect the key role that equitable land and resource governance plays in promoting development objectives. She's co-author of USAID's Land and Conflict Toolkit. She has over 2 decades of experience working on land and development issues. Ms. Boudreaux, who is a lawyer by training, was previously Chief Program Officer at Lasa, a global nonprofit that works on land issues around the world, as well as the land and resource rights practice lead at the CloudWorks Group, a USAID implementing partner. Before that, she served as the Africa Land Tenure Specialist with USAID, and Ms. Boudreaux has also published widely on topics related to land tenure and property, and she has worked in countries around the world to strengthen and support the land and resource rights of women and men. Thank you for joining us. We're also joined by Mr. Ibere Lopes, a housing, land, and property legal and policy specialist with over 20 years of international experience. He's an HLP advisor at the International Organization for Migration and the HLP focal point to the Global Shelter Cluster. Before his time at IOM, he contributed his expertise to Tetra Tech, DAI, the World Bank, UNDP, and the International Development Law Organization, with a focus on long-term land titling programs and property restitution initiatives. His current work centers on land tenure issues in post-conflict and post-disaster settings, having led land tenure projects in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Haiti, as well as emergency deployments in Ethiopia, DRC, South Sudan, Nigeria, Burundi, Indonesia, and Vanuatu. Thank you for joining us. We're also joined by Ms. Irantzu Serra. She's a senior director for disaster risk reduction and response with Habitat for Humanity International. She leads Habitat's technical team supporting affiliated entities around the world to prepare and respond to disasters impacting their communities. In prior roles with Habitat, she led a team providing technical assistance for the Asia-Pacific region, including HOP, construction, disaster risk reduction and response, and urban development. Before Habitat for Humanity, she worked for the Red Cross as a shelter and settlements advisor, engaging in HOP issues post and pre-disaster. She's an architect and urban planning by training from Spain and alumna of the Harvard National Preparedness Leadership Initiative in France. So with that, we'll open it up to who will lead us off with his perspectives.
Thank you, Dahlia, for the introduction, and thank you for helping create this opportunity to discuss issues and trends in HLP with you and the participants and panelists. Also want to thank Howard University, IOM, Interaction for organizing this, hosting this really important event. And again, I think it's one of the first ever conflict here in the U.S., so very significant. People who know me know that I often say context, context, context when presenting a training session or lecture. I describe this as the international humanitarian community's equivalent mantra to that old real estate development saw of location, location, location. Context is the forum, platform, where concerns about gender and poverty and marginality and informality and urbanization and climate change and localization, the interplay of humanitarian assistance and development concerns and other, where they emerge, manifest, and interact. Addressing HOP issues in an effective manner is all but impossible if efforts to address those issues do not feature a strong focus on context, the housing and communities that have generated those issues, an understanding of the markets and socioeconomic relations influencing growth, conditions, and change in housing and communities. Addressing HLP issues is best done then when based on an understanding of context, the places where people live and work and create that are known collectively as human settlements, or settlements for short. To do this, we've developed a settlements approach intended to provide a physical, social, economic, and environmental context or framework to inform responses to needs in an integrated, multi-sector manner so that all residents of crisis-affected communities can be assisted as effectively and supportively as possible. This approach should be familiar to a domestic audience as a planning process intended to guide the equitable, safe, and sustainable development of communities. In the international arena, the humanitarian community has come to use the word shelter for home and settlements for communities. I realize that shelter in the U.S. has very particular meanings that don't always correspond to the use of the word shelter in the international arena. But a different understanding of terms cannot mask the strong similarities of HLP issues among crisis-affected populations in the U.S. and elsewhere. And the pattern has become very clear in recent years that poor and marginalized communities are often most heavily impacted when crises occur, but be they generated by conflict or natural hazard events. Repeated crises, such as the 20 or so typhoons and other natural events that occur in the Philippines every year, for example, further erodes the ability of communities to withstand future crises. This is particularly the case for the most vulnerable and marginalized residents of those communities. In many communities affected by crisis and disaster, it is often the majority of people who do not have any legally recognized recognize housing and property rights, meaning they are not recognized by authorities and don't exist. This is generally the case in highly vulnerable and primarily urban, and I would say increasingly urban, informal, slum, squatter, and otherwise pejoratively labeled communities, where estimated 1 billion people currently live. It's more than people on the planet. USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance Legacy Office, the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, or OFDA, began a large-scale shelter and settlements program in Kabul, Afghanistan, where an estimated 85% of the population did not possess any official documentation of home, land, or property ownership. We worked with local authorities and communities to recognize a right to occupancy of project beneficiaries to prevent eviction from and demolition of their homes. Even today, this effort to formalize the informal status of most Kabul residents endures. In conclusion, we've done a lot to improve HLP issues in some communities, but so much remains to be done in so many other communities. Focusing on context, informing work through a settlements approach that links shelter and settlements activities to other activities such as water, health, protection, economic development in an integrated manner, and collaborating closely with marginalized communities to highlight their concerns and needs will enable us to more effectively address HLP issues in the future. And I would submit to you that the future is now. I look forward to working with you on this exceedingly important effort. Thank you again for your time and interest, and I will see you in the field.
Thank you, Chuck. We'll move on to Ms. Karol Boudreaux, Senior Land and Resource Governance Advisor at USAID.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. It is so great to be here today at Howard University. This is my first time visiting Howard, and just wonderful to be here. Thanks to all the folks who were involved in organizing this session. For those of us on the development side, we've been missing the World Bank's Land and Poverty Conference. It's nice to be able to be together in person in a different venue, so thank you so much. I am delighted to be able to build today on what Chuck was just talking about with regard to the importance of context. And I'm going to build on that by noting that just as context matters critically for the humanitarian sector, it also, of course, matters critically for development work that we do on housing, land, and property. So what I'd like to do over the next just couple of minutes is think about the tenure context that we're typically addressing, and note that the tenure context exists across a continuum pre-crisis, during crisis, and post-crisis. Lise was talking about how land tenure and property rights issues can be addressed during and post-crisis. I'm going to talk about the pre-crisis, because I think another one of our panelists is going to talk about post-crisis. And this is a great place for development professionals to be thinking and to be concentrating our efforts. So my sort of framing questions for the next couple of moments are, what can development professionals be doing today to address gaps or weaknesses in the tenure context, to address the power dynamics and imbalances that exist, and strengthen the resilience of people and communities so that we can mitigate or have different opportunities to address crises tomorrow, because we know they're coming, right? There's no end of crises in sight. And so let's think about what we can be doing today to reduce or mitigate those crises tomorrow. And others on the panel will speak about what we can be doing post-crisis or to address some of the issues that Lise was mentioning. Okay, so I'm going to talk today very briefly, and this is high level, of course, about 3 buckets of actions that I think we could be taking pre-crisis to support policy planning and implementation efforts that hopefully do help reduce risks, mitigate risks, and improve resilience. Okay, here's my sort of somewhat cheesy way of labeling these 3 buckets. The first bucket, we need to be assessing what is. That means finding the gaps and conflicts as well as the opportunities that exist to improve adaptive capacities and effective planning at multiple levels in advance of crisis. That can include things like before crisis, understanding the political economy. Who are your allies in the HLP sector? Who are your enemies in the HLP sector? How are you going to be able to build effective coalitions with civil society, with government, with the private sector to affect the change you need to affect? What do the legal and policy environments look like? We know on the development side that these legal and policy environments often are in conflict, they are not harmonized, and there is room to make improvements, particularly to recognize and protect the rights of women and other marginalized communities. And speaking of that, do we really understand what the social and gender norms are pre-crisis in a particular tenure context? Can we work in advance to try to address some of those discriminatory or otherwise harmful gender and social norms so that when crisis comes, we're in a better place to respond to the needs of the marginal? Okay, so that's bucket number one. Bucket number two, Lise mentioned this. Make the invisible visible. We need to be working to identify in advance of crises where people and communities are, not have blank pages, blank spaces on maps. Those of us probably all of us in this room have had the experience of walking into a particular office, having someone show you a map of an area, and you will see on the map no people, no settlements, but you might see something like a big agricultural concession or a mining concession or something else. We need to put people and their communities on the map. We need to put women on the map. We need to put youth on the map. We need to put migrants and we need to put ethnic minorities on those maps so governments, civil society, and others can do better planning. If the people aren't visible, how can they be part of the process? Okay, so my third and final bucket is we need to be aligning incentives. Aligning incentives in advance of crisis so that people are more resilient during and after crisis. What might some of these incentives be? Well, they might be some of the things Lise mentioned around rental subsidies to make access to housing, quality housing, easier, more affordable. But I do a lot of work in rural areas. We could also, I like almost all my work in rural areas. We could also be thinking about creating incentives to support nature-based solutions that would make urban communities more resilient over time. That could be by setting up, protecting, supporting community forestry management organizations, water users organizations, other rural communities who are doing the hard work today of protecting ecosystems, but are not being benefited from or receiving the benefits of ecosystem service provision. And we could be thinking about issues like green infrastructure. And I want to say, getting ready for this panel, I started diving into, this is a very scary realm for someone like me, natural capital accounting. I'm a lawyer, I'm not an accountant, but I saw a lot of potential in the idea of natural capital accounting to bring more information about land into those processes. So those of you who know more about that, maybe you can tell us more about it. So I'm just going to say one or two other words about this with some examples about what we might think about today to make these systems better for tomorrow. So Lise mentioned questions of restitution and compensation. Today, we could be working on how we improve valuation of rural lands and urban lands so that when it is time for people to be compensated, they actually are compensated effectively and fairly. This is a huge issue, particularly in rural areas where valuation of customary lands is still at its early stages. Communities are not adequately compensated for the resources that they may end up losing. And we could be doing more today to help on that front. We, of course, could also be helping to improve eminent domain or compulsory acquisition laws and rules so that those laws and rules are not used in an arbitrary fashion, but are used more effectively. One thing that I might focus on, because I'm a lawyer, what the heck could we be doing today to reduce caseloads that in many countries are, the majority of which are focused on land and property issues? How could we be helping the justice system clear out those caseloads today so that tomorrow when those restitution cases come through, there's more room in the system to address those important pressing needs rather than claims from a decade ago that are still lingering in court systems. I know this will be heretical. I apologize to my legal profession colleagues who are in the room, but tools like artificial intelligence might actually be tested to help us do a little bit of that work. What about making the invisible visible? My colleague Joanna Bouvier, who's here with me today and representing USAID, can talk about the way in which we're using fit-for-purpose and participatory approaches to help communities map and record their land rights in ways that can provide them with increased tenure security and understanding of their boundaries and enable them to work with governments and others more effectively over time to leverage their land holdings for purposes that they find to be of use. I would say another thing we should be thinking about doing is if we're going to be building green infrastructure in the future, we need to be thinking today about how we can include local peoples, these invisible persons, in the process of planning for and designing, not just planning for and giving voice to, but actually helping to design some of those. I'll tie up with aligning the incentives, because here's where I think development folks can do a lot of interesting work now. And that would be thinking about things like, are there ways to increase urban resilience through the provision of nature-based solutions that are really located in rural areas? So how would it be helpful to urban dwellers to have forests, watersheds that don't exist within the bounds of a city protected? And what are the legal structures we need, the payment structures that we need in place today to give rural people the incentives to protect those resources and to benefit from those protective actions so that urban dwellers can benefit in the future? Another issue that I think is really very interesting is how can we work today to improve the legal frameworks for things like urban agriculture, to green up urban spaces in ways that will not only contribute maybe marginally to food security, but help green urban spaces. In many countries, urban agriculture is either not recognized under urban land use planning processes or not permitted. And so finding some approaches that are more flexible around that could be quite useful. And finally, I haven't really talked about the private sector, but clearly the private sector has a huge role to play here in terms of not only helping to make the invisible visible, developing new technologies that we can leverage, undertaking different practices themselves to use resources in a different way, helping us to understand what are the barriers they're facing to doing better work, but importantly, directing climate and conservation financing in ways that will help promote resilience of local communities. So I know I kind of cheated by just raising a lot of questions, but it's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Karol. Moving on, we'll hear from Mr. Ibere Lopes, Housing, Land, and Property Advisor at IOM.
Thank you. Thank you, Dahlia. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so happy that we managed to pull together this conference in the US. I've also been missing the Land and Poverty Conference of the World Bank, and since I've rarely been managed to go to these conferences, I said, well, why not we'll create our own, we'll talk to our own people. So it's good to be here, and I wanted to bring back the discussion to the HLP in post-crisis phase. And I wanted to take stock of the things that we have accomplished so far, right? Because 10 years ago, we didn't talk much about HLP in the emergency response. And now it's almost a consensus that HLP is crucial for emergency response and for durable solutions. So we have that. We popularized HLP in the sector. Everyone thinks that it's important, everyone thinks that it's relevant, and everyone wants to provide solutions for HLP issues and obstacles to the response. We also reactivated the HLP AOR globally. So we have the cluster system globally, and HLP is under the protection cluster. There is an area of responsibility under the protection cluster that was activated sporadically, but now in the past 5 years, it has been very active. And that's also an accomplishment of having a global mechanism for coordinating the sector. Also in the national level, in the responses, in the different crisis responses in post-conflict and post-disaster, we see more and more local HLP areas of responsibility being set up in the emergency response, something that we didn't see 10 years ago, 5 years ago even. So that's another accomplishment. So I think that we've advanced a lot, and we have more and more organizations joining the efforts to work on HLP. Now, IOM has HLP teams, UNHCR has them, we have NRCs who are very active in the sector. Even DRC now has, DRC has an HLP person recently. So many organizations are joining this effort, and that's another accomplishment. So we've come far. Now, what are we still missing? And I think this is the crucial part for me in this discussion, which is these guys, USAID, the World Bank, other developments, land tenure people. They have a very mature sector in their hands, and they have learned many lessons. They have produced a lot of knowledge in the sector. You have a whole academic sector that also interacts with the development sector. And we don't have the same in the HLP in the emergencies sector. We don't have that. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to build that knowledge. We have a little bit of lessons learned here and there. We have some guidelines, and we've learned from our work in the field, but we don't have the body of work, we don't have the repertoire that you guys in the development sector have built in the past decades. Right? So I think that we need to strengthen this connection between the HLP in the crisis response with the HLP development. We have a lot to gain from that. And I think this conference is definitely a step in that direction. So I'm very, very pleased that we have this. The other thing that we're missing that we need to start working on is getting more people in the sector, right? Because even though I think that in the development side of things, you have a lot of professionals that come into the sector and replenish the positions that are needed. In the HLP side, HLP in emergency, we don't have that also. It's very rare to find HLP professionals. People don't even know, the students, the law students and urban planners don't even know that that's a sector. Right? So I think that popularizing HLP in emergencies in universities, in a master's course and postgrad, I think it's very important also to attract more people to the sector. We need more of these human resources. And so that's why in the training that we're going to do today, I'm hoping to have a lot of students so that they can be exposed also to this field and hopefully come to the bright side of the force. So with that, I conclude by saying that I think that the discussions here are going to be very, very rich, and I wanted to ask one question of you. So Karol, you mentioned that we could do a lot of work in the pre-crisis phase, right? And to strengthen tenure in preparation for crisis. So if that would be a program or project, securing tenure in anticipation of crisis, where would this sit? Would it be a BHA project or would it be an USAID project?
It would be a cross-bureau project. And we would be holding hands with our BHA colleagues physically, right? It would metaphorically be holding hands and working together as we should be to try to build stronger programming over time.
Okay.
It's doable, right? It's not necessarily easy, but certainly very doable.
Oh, that's good to know that you can, we can all work together.
We can do that, can't we, Chuck?
Yeah? Okay. See, that's something that I learned today already. But thank you then.
Thank you, Barry. All right, and we'll now hear from Ms. Irantzu Serra Lasa, the Senior Director, Disaster Risk Reduction Response at Habitat for Humanity International. Thank you,
Dahlia. So first of all, thank you to Howard University for hosting us. This is a campus that it's also the first time that I come, and it's really, really cool to be here. Thank you to Interaction and USAID and IOM for pushing for this conference and for having Habitat for Humanity here. For those of you who are based of the US, you might actually know Habitat for Humanity for its volunteer work and the work that we do building houses, but we do much more than that. We are present in over 70 countries internationally, and we have over 1,100 affiliates in the US. We do have housing, land, and property, or HOP, at the core of what we do. Land tenure is extremely connected to housing. You cannot separate it. Obviously, it's also connected to other assets for income generation. But in the case of housing, it's at the core of being able to have housing. I want to remind that housing is a human right and is the right to adequate housing. And this right has 4 entitlements. One of them is secure tenure, which talks to the development side or where we're doing to prepare. The other one, housing, land, and property restitution, which he very, very well was talking about. But it also has 2 more entitlements, equal and non-discriminatory access to housing, which Howard is working really hard on it, and then participation of communities, both at the national level and in their community on housing-related decision-making. So Habitat is definitely working on those pieces. We do not work in conflict yet, but we definitely work in preparedness and in response, mostly related to reconstruction and long-term recovery. So with that said, and knowing that that is a right, and that is what we're trying to make sure that everybody has access to, Habitat right now is launching a campaign that is called Home Equals. And home has been an asset for each of one of us that actually has immense implications on development. If you don't have a home, all the other things actually cannot happen. So there is a lot of funding that goes to different sectors, but when you actually are able to focus from the home, you really can have a much more exponential impact on all of the other pieces. So in this campaign, and you can see it in our website, we have launched a research piece that is focusing in those who are the most vulnerable in the world in accessing housing and secure housing. And those are those living in informal settlements, which also Chuck was referencing. And this report, which is based on data and evidence, and has been doing a pretty wide literature review and also statistical modeling. It's about how improving housing in informal settlements can have immense repercussions in the GDP of the world, can actually increase up to 10.5% the GDP in some countries, and get more than 41 million kids to school just by being able to get that adequate housing in informal settlements. And I'm talking about informal settlements because when a disaster strikes, those are the areas that tend to be most heavily impacted. And they're impacted in 2 ways. They are very vulnerable in terms of where they are located. Usually the house situation is not necessarily resilient or is not built with technologies that can actually sustain the impacts of a disaster. But also the settlement itself may not actually have the characteristics to be able to be resilient. So we have one, Chuck, you were quoting the urban population in informal settlements. Well, if you also count the rural population, it goes to 1.8 billion people. That's a huge amount of people that are at risk and that are living without access to secure housing or adequate housing. So when we actually have those informal settlements and they get impacted by disasters, people suffer from the 2 situations. One, they lose the assets that they have been building, and usually self-built. They don't necessarily have a lot of support from governments or
the private sector, and informality is the way that it works. But also reconstruction becomes much more complex. You might have actually remember when the Haiti earthquake happened and the issues in security of tenure, or even how to being able to navigate the title situation. Like there was multiple overlapping titles and a lot of disputes, and that literally hindered reconstruction for years. We have those cases in the US too. You may remember Katrina, where the legal tenure in New Orleans was actually coming from the French type of legislation, and that created also a lot of complexities to being able to provide people with assistance. But those sound like, okay, this is from quite a bit. Well, if we actually look just 5 years ago, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, that was a huge, huge impact on housing, land, and property issues in the island, because FEMA, guess what? You can only access funding from FEMA if you own your house, if you can show proof of ownership. How many people in Puerto Rico actually got delayed support because of not having proof of their access to housing? And later on, there is a panel on, I believe it's the community panel that is going to be touching on that, but I believe also the domestic policy and practice that will be looking into those issues. So definitely housing, land, and property issues are at the core, post-disaster are at the core, or development. And there is also connections that link that when we invest in housing, land, and property, there might be improvements in terms of resilience. And Habitat, with the support from USAID, for example, had a project in Portsmouth, Jamaica, in 3 informal settlements, they were urban informal settlements in Jamaica, connecting and making sure that the mapping of the rights of informal dwellers in those settlements were in some way formalized, so that the city was able to see who actually had rights to what, and that created a cascading effects. What I would caveat, though, is that housing, land, and property per se and on its own is not going to get the results that we need. It needs to be connected with access to financing, or to the ability to being able to improve your housing on your assets. So you can separate, it's all part of a system. Yes, people may be able to actually get more secure tenure and not be evicted, but if they don't have access to financial resources to improve their housing, resilience is not going to be achieved. So we need to look into those pieces all connected. And with this, thank you, everyone, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your perspectives. So I think we'll open up to the discussion, this idea of formalizing the informal. This is like overarching theme, making the invisible visible. So I'll start with you, Chuck. Maybe discussing a bit more about the Karol case study, where you talked about this idea of formalizing the informal and right to occupancy. So can you just shed some more details on strategies and lessons learned there?
Great, thank you. Kabul, Afghanistan, 2004, post 9/11 activities, the international communities starting to orient programming and reconstruction, humanitarian assistance. City of Kabul, which was about 1.5 million people at the time of 9/11, by 2007 had approached 5 million people. It was at the time considered the most rapidly growing city in the world. We immersed ourselves into that growth bubble, trying to understand what needs existed for shelter and settlements, as well as all of the related issues of health and protection, et cetera. So as a part of our initial assessments, we realized that there was no cadastral, there was no property rights records. So we needed to essentially start over in some of the neighborhoods that we were working in. Part of our initial assessment, not only to identify needs, was to understand who owned what and where. So how did we do that? We triangulated information of people that provided information to us through a trusted local individuals who tended to be the imams in the neighborhoods that we were working in. And they helped us and our implementing partner understand who owned what where. And then we also needed to understand who would be secondarily displaced as a result of trying to clarify these identified HLP issues. So we entered into, as a part of our assistance program, entered into a memorandum of agreement with the city government, the implementing partner, the local residents, and USAID to establish, frankly, a legally unenforceable memorandum of agreement, but a socially recognized MOU that held that for 3 to 5 years, the individuals who are our beneficiaries would be protected from forced evictions or demolitions with a rollover clause, very convenient rollover clause that people conveniently forgot about. And that's up to this time, those very, very informal rights have been essentially identified and formalized as part of the larger discussion of recovery and development in the city of Kabul. So we created a mechanism that was widely publicized and widely recognized as a means of clarifying who owned what and where.
Okay, great. Just kind of thinking about that idea of formalizing the informal. Iro, you talked about the importance of focusing on informal settlements pre-crisis. So can you shed some light on some of the lessons learned in the BRACE project in Portmore, Jamaica, and any sort of strategies or recommendations for donors? Because you talked about the importance of access to financing in that work. So any recommendations to donors that are looking to reduce disaster risk in informal settlements?
Yes. So the project in Jamaica and a lot of the projects that we work when we include land tenure is intended to be a holistic project. You do not, at least Habitat does not tackle land tenure in isolation. It's always part of a bigger system. And it included at first a mapping of what were actually the needs and really understanding not just who owned what, but actually who had rights to what. And really looking beyond the ownership piece, but the right of occupation, the right, there were renters in the informal settlements, and really trying to understand all of those different levels of occupation or connection to the land and the housing. What really actually, with the intentions of that, you're not missing anyone behind. If you only look at who owns what, you might be leaving behind renters or migrants who actually will not be able to get any kind of support. We were also providing the HOP work connected with retrofitting of houses. So in that case, what we were doing was providing financing and in an owner-driven way to the different households to be able to improve their housing through structural improvements, because Jamaica obviously is prone to disasters, especially flash flooding and storms. And the ability to improve those structural components of the dwelling actually would make the house more resilient. And we also connected with water management, both from sewage and water and sanitation. So that was kind of the interventions at the neighborhood level. We also work with a coalition to being able to work with a private sector to really be able to provide more access to either to microfinance so that things could actually keep connecting. So definitely the financial piece is at the core. If people don't have access to that, things are not going to happen. Some of the recommendations to donors definitely would be to not only look at the who owns what or the land's rights from a perspective of ownership. Habitat had a long history to supporting home ownership in the US, and when we started looking internationally, we realized that that was not a one-size-fits-all. And making sure that the continuum of land rights is seen, and is mapped in a way that you're not leaving behind the most vulnerable or communities that may not actually have things documented.
Great, thank you. I'll go over to Karol then, just kind of picking up on this idea of the pre-crisis and some of the needs there. I know you raised a lot of questions, so I guess maybe expanding a bit on some of your thoughts on the development side and some of the challenges within the solutions and questions that you raised. Like, where do we really need to be focused? What are some of the challenges there?
Oh, there are tons of challenges. There's a lot of work to be done, but that's good, right? Because that means that we'll be busy for some time. So I think there are a lot of challenges. I want to echo the point on access to finance. We should not think about securing land tenure and property rights in advance of a crisis as a silver bullet or some kind of panacea. It is an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the entirety of the puzzle. What we know, though, at least in rural areas from a pretty robust evidence base, is that it's very difficult to use rural lands, particularly as collateral for access to credit. It may be different in urban spaces or peri-urban spaces, but in rural areas, it's actually quite challenging. So what are some of the other alternatives that you could be using if you're, say, working in an area where there is going to be resettlement in the future? Mozambique might be an example of this. The government identifies resettlement areas and then people move when there are disasters. Using strategies like support for village savings and loan associations, SACCOs, whatever they're called in the particular context, that can be maybe an alternative way to provide some access to credit that's not really reliant on the collateralization of the land or the buildings on the land. But I totally agree that that's a really key piece of the puzzle. I do think that I'm going to go back to Ibere's sort of poke at me about like what can the development people do with the humanitarian people. I do think whether it's through USAID's new climate strategy or through some of our other strategies, we do have an interest in systems change and taking a systems approach to addressing different kinds of changes. And if you're adopting a systems approach to change, it would suggest that I get out of my silo and Chuck, maybe, I don't know, maybe we can come to his silo. Maybe he comes out of his silo too. But there should be good ways for development and humanitarian professionals to try to identify a couple of areas where it would be useful for both of us to work together to try to make both of our work streams a little bit more manageable into the future. Many of you will know USAID does relatively little work on the development side in urban spaces, urban resilience, sustainable cities. That might be a good place for us to do a little bit more work together. Thank you.
Great, thank you. You talked about making those work streams more manageable, and you mentioned caseloads and technology and AI. So I'll put this to Ibere. Because you talked about some of the challenges, knowledge gaps, more HLP professionals, thinking about, some of those technical gaps. Do you see, and this may be for everyone, do you see opportunities for technology and kind of innovating around some of the ways we think about technology in this HLP space, in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I do actually. I think that technology is not a panacea. I think technology is not supposed to, we can't use technology just for the sake of technology. But I think that there's a place for it if it's relevant to the goal that we want to achieve. So for example, I think there's a lot of hype around blockchain, for example, for land registration. But I think it's yet to prove useful. But I don't think we should discard it because I think it's a very powerful technology, distributed ledgers. For example, drone technology for mapping it has advanced incredibly in the past even 3 years, and now we have drones that can do cadastral mapping with orthophoto. Maybe I'm speaking Martian here, but anyway, so making maps that are useful for doing the cadastral mapping very easily and much cheaper than doing with airplanes. AI as well, of course. I think we definitely have a place in it. So I think, yes, we can and we should investigate these possibilities. But also not only technology in terms of IT tech, but also in terms of different processes that we can investigate. So use the conventional process or the practices that are already used in the countries where we work and try to improve them. So for example, we were exploring, I was in Burundi a few weeks ago, and we were exploring the possibility of using micro title insurance. You know, title insurance is something that's quintessentially American, you don't see anywhere else. But it's an interesting mechanism to bridge the gap of risk if you don't have very secure tenure, right? So if financial institutions find it too risky to use land as collateral, you could have some sort of micro insurance that will bridge that gap. So things like that also, I think, go into the bucket of technology, but they're not tech per se.
And I'll put that to anyone else. I know you mentioned AI, Karol, but any opportunities you see kind of working in this sort of formalizing the informal and innovations in technology that could be useful?
Definitely, and I think the more that technology is coming to our handset, like we have a phone in a lot of places, even in informal settlements, people are connected and they do have access to cell phones. We've been using technology on this mapping and really trying to connect and understand with communities what are the risks that they are facing in terms, for example, of looking at risk maps and making those available at the local level in a way that is much more tangible and that can be done through technology. I mean, all of those resources are available for the municipalities or for even higher level, how to get those to the community so that they can understand the risk that they face and they can make decisions on improving their housing or based on actually the risk that they have. Other things that we've been, for example, having conversations is with insurance companies. They do have a very detailed risk maps and understanding on cost of recovery or rebuilding. They tend to hoard to that data, especially because that's gold and is what the competition may or may not be able to have. The more accurate, the more that they can be attuned, but they are willing to share that data in places that they are not operational. So having those interactions with insurance companies that can be able to have access to that information definitely can prove very effective. It's not going to be to the same level of detail that some places here in the US where they might actually have people with insurance with them, but they do have similar type of information at a little bit more higher level in places that they don't operate.
Okay, great.
One comment. Products are important. Maps are very important. Perhaps AI will become increasingly important, but process is very important as well. And who's around the table is kind of important, and who you're speaking with. Some of the most gratifying and effective work I've done in my career is literally being in a circle, handing a stick from one to another to design a city. We can do that with computers now, I understand that. But process is important, and who's at the table is important as well.
Okay, great. I think that was a great way to end the discussion, the idea of process and community. So thank you, all panelists. Unfortunately, we're at the end of this session, but I think this was a great way to kick off the discussions that will happen in the breakout sessions. And we can definitely continue these conversations. So I'm going to hand it over to Julie, who's going to just tell us where we go next.
Well, thank you to our opening panelists and moderator today. We really appreciate your time. We are now going to move into our 3 parallel sessions. So for those that would like to go to the collective and community land rights session, that will be in the glass walls right behind us here. For those that would like to go to the HLP and conflict session, you will go up the stairs and follow the signs to room 150. And for those that would like to go to the domestic land policy and practice session, you will go up the stairs and follow the signs to the Silcott Gallery. So if everyone can go ahead and make their way to their next session. Thank you.